Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame, and welcome back to the TCF YouTube channel. This week I'm going to do something a little different. I've been, critiquing or commenting on images that people have been uploading to the Flickr pool, but one of the things that I wanted to do is to provide an alternative to discussion of gear that typically happens. I watch a lot of YouTube videos on equipment, and sometimes they just kind of are, well, they leave me wanting so much more. They may videotape a camera that they're handling in their hands and talking about specs and features, but it really gives me no sense in terms of what it's going to be like in the real world making photographs. So I had a recent experience with a camera, and I wanted to talk about that experience and to give some insight into my own personal experience using the camera for the kind of work that I do. And it's not going to be a comprehensive review because God knows there's enough websites and blogs and videos that are out there that will do that. I just wanted to give you a little sort of insight into how I shoot, what my pictures are like, and how a particular camera, lens, or a piece of software sort of helps me to do what I wanted to do. So, as some of you may or may not know, I took a trip to France this summer, and I was there for a good length of time. And I borrowed a camera, this camera specifically, the X100s, for this trip. And I had taken some other cameras, but I went there with the intent of using this camera pretty much exclusively for the trip, and I did it for a variety of reasons. First off, I'd heard so much about the X100s in terms of its performance as a camera for street photography, which I have an affinity for. And so I wanted to really have the chance to try it for an extended period of time and really have a sense of whether or not this camera is all that it's hyped up to be in terms of shooting. And and one of the things that I wanted to do is to see how this compares to a lot of the other cameras that I've used. I've used, as part of my job writing magazine articles, I've used Canons, Nikons, Samsungs, Pentexes. So I have a lot of experience under my belt with a variety of different cameras. And one of the things that's always really true, regardless of what model it is that you always have to learn the particulars of that camera in order to use it effectively. There's only so much that you can get from reading the specifications or the feature blurbs when a new camera comes out. It's only when you actually go out there and actually use it on the street or in the studio that you really discover whether or not that camera is going to be best for you. So I'm going to show you some pictures that I took there, and I'm going to relate it to certain things that I want to focus on this camera. And one of the first things that I wanted to address was the fact that this is a fixed 23 millimeter lens, which is the equivalent of a 35 millimeter on a full frame camera. And this lens is permanently mounted on here, so I can't take the lens off and put something else on there. And at first I thought that would be a disadvantage, but it really wasn't. I sort of cut my teeth with photography with a 35 and a 50 millimeter lens. So I really kind of had a sense of what the world looks like through that particular focal length. So it was mostly getting past the idea that I wouldn't have a zoom lens, or I wouldn't have an 85, or I wouldn't have a 24 at hand to be able to get different photographs. But I quickly found that I didn't mind the fact that I didn't have other lenses to choose from, and actually it was kind of a relief because it really allowed me to focus exclusively on just composition and making the shots happen. And this is one of the very first shots that I made during that trip. And me and my wife were walking towards Notre Dame, and I saw these security gates on the across this little roadway here. And I looked at it and I told my wife, "Wow, this would make a really great backdrop for a photograph." So I kind of stopped and I made several pictures, some of just the doors themselves, and these little sort of posts that were within the frame, just making a graphic shot. But then I started waiting for people to come into the frame. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw this guy walking, and I physically grabbed the camera and I started shooting him, But then as he started moving down the roadway, I started following him and also getting physically closer in order to frame the shot in the way that I wanted to. And thankfully, he stopped at this one point to light his cigarette. And this is one of my favorite shots from the trip, because I love how his figure, his dark clothing sort of mimics the repetition of the posts that are in the middle of the frame, and how his bald head is actually sort of a repetition of the shape of the ball at the end of those posts, and just the sort of the tones and the contrast that are inherent to the frame. And one of the good things I found by not being too dependent on the zoom, I was physically having to change my relationship to him and the background by actively moving. And I was, walking however number of feet or yards in order just to keep up with him, to keep him sort of parallel to what I wanted. And it was, if I'd had a zoom, I don't know if I would have kept up with him, or made the choice to keep up with him rather than just sort of turning the camera and just adjusting the zoom focal length. Because I was working with a 35, I knew I needed to keep a certain perspective and a certain percentage of elements within the frame in order to make this shot work. So it made me a much more active photographer. The same was this case here. We were in the Luxembourg garden, and I saw this woman watching these people playing tennis. And at first, I was a good distance away from her, and I started making shots well before I made this final frame here. And I was including more. I had a lot more in the frame. And as I started walking closer and closer, I kept making exposures after exposure, to the point I was literally right behind her in some of the final shots that I made. But I actually found that I liked this shot the most. And I found that a lot of my shots from this trip were really served by using the 35 millimeter equivalent, because not only was I wasn't just fixated on just photographing the subject, but I was also trying to establish a sense of place. I was in Paris for a good number of these images, so I wanted to always include images that provided that as a context, to make it seem that, or to make it people realize that they weren't just seeing a photograph that could be made anywhere. I wanted to make the city of Paris as much about the photograph as anything else. One of the other things about the camera was its autofocus capability, and people who used the original version of the X100 kind of complained that the focus really wasn't fast enough. And for me, I found that the camera was adequate for most shooting situations, but not always. Sometimes when I saw something and I immediately had to be able to react, I couldn't get the picture because sometimes the camera goes to sleep, and so I would have to wake it up by tapping on the shutter release button to wake it up, which takes a second or two, and then I would be able to focus and take my photograph. But as long as I was able to sort of anticipate a moment, if I was walking down the street and I saw something I anticipated I wanted to photograph, I would just tap on the button and would just have the camera ready, and then I would just raise it to my eye, autofocus, and take the picture. And 8 times out of 10, it was able to sort of nail it, and I didn't have any problems. So I didn't really have any issue with the speed of the autofocus as long as the camera was awake. But there were times when I really didn't have a subject within the frame, and I needed to pre-focus manually. And in that case, it does give you some benefits there, including what I want to call a zebra effect, and I don't think that's the right name for it. It gives you like a split level viewfinder option, which I didn't use particularly much, but I did use sometimes when I use the electronic viewfinder, the sort of a zebra effect where you see this sort of pattern, and then it sort of lets you know, it confirms that you have autofocused, or that you've manually focused on the correct spot. But more often than not, I was using the optical viewfinder. And in cases like for this particular photograph, I was just sort of pre-focusing manually, and then I had enough depth of field for this shot and many others, where I didn't have to be really spot on the focus. I just needed to make sure that the subject, when they moved, was in that range of depth of field that would produce an acceptably sharp photograph. In this case, I was shooting at about f8, and I was in Biarritz for this photograph, and these kids were just doing all these tricks on these skateboards, and I positioned myself here so that I could get at a very low angle, so when they caught air, I would be able to get a sharp photograph. And because I had set it manually on this kid here, on this railing here, I knew that even if I wasn't autofocusing on this kid as he was moving into the frame and up into the center of the frame, that it still would be acceptably sharp. So I found that whether the camera was performing in autofocus or in manual focus, it really was able to deliver. This is in Brussels, and this is one of those situations where I built the photograph around the light. And there was this shaft of light that was coming into this middle of the middle of the street here, and I knew I wanted people to move into the light in order for me to make my photograph. And this was a situation where the shaft of light really created a pocket of light that was really, really narrow. And so I couldn't depend on the autofocus to get the autofocus in time for me to get the shot. There would be always a sort of a slight delay between the moment I would press the shutter release button, it would autofocus, and it would take the picture. Literally, these people were in this shaft of light for just a couple of seconds, and then they would be out of it. So in this case, I actually pre-focused on the spot where the light was hitting, and then I just allowed people to walk into the frame. And again, I really had to be conscious about what I wanted the picture to look like with respect to sharpness and focus. And again, I was using a very small aperture here at f11. So I had a real generous depth of field. So even if I didn't have the figures hit the exact spot that I had pre-focused on, I had enough depth of field in order to be able to get the image sharp. And that's one of the benefits of the fact that this is a 23 millimeter lens. The depth of field that I get from that focal length and the small size of the APS-C sensor provides me ample depth of field, so that this picture was as sharp as it could be, considering the kind of challenging circumstances I was faced with. Now, one of the other benefits of the camera is the low light capability. You know, a lot of people talk about full frame sensors, about their ability to perform under low light, but increasingly I'm finding that cameras with APS-C size sensors are really quite amazing in terms of what the camera manufacturers have been able to do with respect to the sensors themselves, and also the processing of that data into the finished file. Here I was shooting Farah Freddy, who was just amazing performer at this jazz club in Paris. And as you can see here, I was shooting at 2500 ISO. The lens was wide open, and I was shooting at about an 80th of a second. And the light on the stage was constantly changing, so I had to sort of spot meter on him and kind of just bias my exposure, because the rest was sort of relegated to shadow, as you can see in the foreground here. And it was just about timing at that point. I knew I had a very slim depth of field, so I surprisingly was able to depend on the autofocus to really nail it, because I just would choose that one AF sensor point and would just keep him in that particular area, and then I would just fire frame after frame after frame. So because of the relatively slow shutter speed of 1/80th of a second, when he was really moving a lot, I got a lot of blurred shots. But I kind of knew that I just needed to anticipate sort of a peak moment when he would be relatively still, and I would be able to get a sharp shot. And when I opened up this image in Lightroom, I was really amazed at how clean the overall image was. This is a shot that was made on the Metro, and the camera's low light capability combined with its small compactness, really allowed me to make photographs which would have been kind of difficult to make under different circumstances. The In really low light situations, I was forced to work with relatively slow shutter speeds. And one of the things that I really liked about the camera was the ability to preset my minimum shutter speed. And that was kind of critical sometimes, because even at a 60th of a second, I really don't feel comfortable hand holding a camera, just because I just introduce a little bit of camera shake, which makes an image less and sharp. So that was something I really kind of benefited from. And here I was shooting about a 1/20th of a second. And this allowed me to get a pretty sharp shot, considering that we were in a metro car. I really had to be careful about sort of timing it so that the car wasn't moving or jostling as much, but also that it was still enough that I'd be able to get a sharp photograph of this couple that were by the door. And this shot wouldn't have been possible with an SLR, especially with the large clunk clunk sound of the mirror and the shutter slapping. I was literally just feet away from this couple, so whenever the train would come to a stop, the doors would open and close, and then they shift the position to allow people in and out. And so I really had to just do a lot of anticipation in terms of when I was going to bring the camera up, because as well as all the technical issues that I was dealing with exposure, with the shutter speed, with sharpness, I was also trying to capture a moment between these two that was rather intimate and that didn't, reveal my presence to them and my camera. So I shot several frames, and this was about the one that I was most happy with. But the camera really made the difference here, because I don't think I could have done this with my 5D Mark III, or at least made as many shots to get what I needed here. Now, here's a shot that I completely attribute to getting because I was using such a small and compact camera like this. We were walking across this bridge here, and I saw this couple, and at first they were embracing. So as I was walking towards them, I was making shot after shot, getting closer and getting closer. And to their left, there were people who were sort of looking back at them and looking back at me, and they were sort of included in the frame. And as I sort of rotated around them, they were so caught up with each other that I literally just stood there and just made photograph after photograph. And the fact that the camera is so incredibly quiet, it really allowed me to sort of refine my composition as they were interacting. And I was just, once I got my composition, I was just waiting for that one moment, that one telling gesture, which I got here when she raised her hand up to his cheek. And like I said before, the 23 millimeter focal length here gave me the opportunity to not just focus on them, but to create a frame where I establish where we are. I mean, this is Notre Dame in the back, and this is the Seine River here, and you immediately know where you are. This is Paris, and here are a couple of young lovers here on the bridge, so focused on themselves that they're completely oblivious to everyone else. And it was just great to be able to slowly get closer and closer and change my position and make the frame to the point that they never saw me or even was aware that I was making photographs of them, or that I was observing them. And this is just a great picture, which I really attribute to the fact that I was using this camera as opposed to something else. Again, being able to move close with this camera, which is so quiet, was really one of the things that I really liked about it. I've been trying with a lot of my photographs to get more physically intimate with my subjects, whether they know I'm photographing them or not. And being able to position myself and make several frames and sort of change my position relative to them in the background was really sort of key. I made this at a metro station, and I had already made several shots of this fellow from behind. And when I saw the train coming, I really just sort of had to time it, because I knew I didn't just want the blur of the train whizzing by him completely. And it was sort of anticipating that moment where the background of this frame would be kind of split in half, where I got part of the train and part of the the station itself in the background. And there was part luck and part just good technique that allowed me to get it exactly where I wanted it to, because there's always a slight delay between pressing the shutter release button all the way down and making the photograph. But I had enough practice with the camera that it allowed me to be able to get used to it. And I met with David Hobby while he was there in Paris, and he talked about the idea that, this camera, you really have to learn this camera. It's very different from using with a DSLR. And the fact that I was there for 4 weeks really allowed me to get familiar with the nuances and sort of the characteristics of the camera, because it is different from any other camera that I would use. And sometimes I would be frustrated that it didn't perform like other cameras, but the more and more that I got used to using it for what it was and the way it was designed and its various controls, it became really kind of second nature to me. One of the things that really amazed me about the camera was the metering and the dynamic range on it. And initially, I was sort of dialing down my exposure using the exposure compensation, which is conveniently located here on the top of the camera. And I would bias the exposure by 1/3 to 2/3 of a stop, because I was really concerned with overexposing the highlights and getting those blown out. And I was amazed that when I was shooting with RAW plus JPEG, most of the images you hear were from the RAW file, but occasionally I would choose RAW plus JPEG, and when I would take a look at the JPEGs, when no exposure compensation was applied, that I wasn't getting those blown out highlights, that the camera has an amazing dynamic range. I think it's about 12 stops. And even for those situations where I was exposing for the highlights, the amount of shadow detail that I would get would be amazing. In some other cameras, I would expose for the highlights and with the expectation that the shadows would go really dark and be really black, and I would have no detail there, but it wasn't the case here. So for shots like this, it was, the metering was spot on. Even this area over here had a little more detail than I sort of expected. But in the original file, this has been refined in Photoshop, in Lightroom. The shadow detail here is present, so it's the tonality that the RAW files gives you is amazing, which gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to interpret that image later on. If you've seen any of my images on Flickr, you'll see that I like to crush my blacks. Sometimes I don't want any details in those blacks because I want a lot of sort of high contrast imagery, like in this shot here that I shot in London. And here we were going back to catch the train back to Paris, and I looked behind me and I saw this light coming down the stairwell, and I knew that I wanted to shoot this as a high contrast shot. So I biased the exposure again for the highlights here, wanting these shadows here to go to black. But in the original file, I had a lot of shadow detail here, which really amazed me. So this process file that you're seeing here involved me really bringing in the levels control and really just blocking up the shadows here and creating a vignette that really captured what I had sort of experienced, or what I was envisioning when I made the shot. The fact that this camera, when I bias it for the highlight, gives me as much shadow detail as it does is nice. It's nice. Even though I may crush the blacks on occasion for some shots, I like the fact that the camera is able to deliver that. And what's really amazing is how good these JPEGs are. You'll hear so much about the quality of the JPEGs, the onboard processing of the camera, but when you actually take pictures with it, I can understand why people just use JPEGs. Zach Arias and David Hobby, they primarily use the cameras and are happy with the JPEGs with them. I haven't gotten on that bandwagon yet. I like the raw flexibility, but sometimes those JPEGs make me think, sometimes whether it's worth all the work to shoot raw and to process it later. There are definitely times when you just want to be able to just shoot JPEGs and not have to worry about that look. This shot was just made in Paris, and there's nothing about the camera specifically that makes this shot happen as opposed to using another camera. But I have to say that the fact that by this time, this was towards the tail end of the trip, I had really gotten comfortable with the camera. I knew what to expect from it in terms of autofocus, in terms of exposure. And so it became as intuitive as any camera can be over a relatively short period of time. But by this time, because I was using the camera every day, um, I got really used to how to change settings like for autofocus or exposure or metering modes and all those other things. Though the camera has a wealth of different features on there, I quickly honed in on those features that were the most importance to me so I could make the shot. So when I saw this kid walking down the street and coming towards this intersection, I already knew that I wanted to be able to use a relatively small, moderate aperture, 6.4 in this case, which would give me more than enough depth of field because I really wanted to have a relatively fast shutter speed to capture this dog, because the way I describe this picture is dog walking boy, because this dog really had a lot of energy and this boy had to really work to control him. So I was able to sort of anticipate the moment, set the camera really quickly in order to be able to make my shot. And that's really critical for me when I'm working on the street. I don't want a camera that's going to get in my way. I don't want a camera that all of a sudden I'm standing there trying to figure out settings or having it perform slower than I need it, so it results in me missing the shot and being frustrated. Granted, there were a lot of shots that I missed initially because I was just getting used to the camera. I only had it for a couple of days before I left for my trip. So the first part of it was just like getting comfortable with it. And by the end of the trip, it felt like absolutely an extension of my hand and my eye, which is really good. I still need to shoot with it more to get completely comfortable with it because it's like a relationship. You really have to spend a lot of time nurturing that relationship, in this case between myself and this camera, to get completely comfortable and to be able to get to the point where I can make my shot and the camera doesn't stand in the way. Sometimes I'm not thinking in the way that the camera is meant to be used, and so that can cause a delay. But for the most part, it's able to deliver the goods. And this is another one shot here of this waiter just cleaning off a table. And here I just knew that I wanted to blow the background out of focus, and so I shot it at a fairly wide aperture and just shot. And a lot of people talk about the fact that with a smaller sensor, you can't blur out the background. But with an aperture of f2, you can do that really easily here. And I was really pleased with how sharp he was, wide open at f2, and how nicely the background was blurred. And it was a good experience using this. I took another camera with me, and I was shooting that on occasion, but oftentimes I would just go, I don't want to carry another camera with 2 or 3 other lenses. I just want to carry this thing and go out and make my photographs. And I found that the whole experience of going out there with a single camera, with a single lens, and shooting every day was really a valuable experience for me. Not just in terms of being able to get familiar with another piece of equipment, but it really kind of reaffirmed with me what my skills and talent are as a photographer. Because of the work that I do, I'm not shooting every day. I'm not going out there and making photographs. But this was a real wonderful experience because it showed me where my strengths were and where I needed to work more and what I needed to work more on. And I think that frequency of shooting, regardless of what kind of camera you use, is really, really important. Having a new toy to use is always a great excuse to go out and shoot, but after that newness sort of wears off, it becomes absolutely critical to create that opportunity to go out there and make the photographs, because I learned so much about my photography, about myself, about what's holding me back, and what really kind of draws me to making good photographs. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm hoping to do more. I'm not going to be doing a lot of reviews like this because I don't get as much equipment as I used to in the past. But anytime that I have the opportunity to use a piece of equipment that I want to talk about, in relation to what I'm doing as a photographer, then you'll see more of those. But next week, we'll get back to the normal videos where I'll be reviewing and evaluating and commenting on the images that you are uploading to the Flickr pool. And there's a link here that you can check out and just ask to join. There are no qualifications. All you have to do is ask to join, and I'll approve you and just upload pictures. And there are an amazing number of photographers that have been uploading pictures, and it's great work. And I encourage you to check out the work, dialogue with each other, take the time to comment, and enjoy. And then if you're finding this video for the first time and you've not listened to the Candid Frame, you're missing out, because the Candid Frame is a podcast in which I interview some of the best established and emerging photographers that are out there. And regardless of what genre of photography you're interested in, you're going to find something, a great takeaway from all of these conversations that I have with these people. You can find it at thecandidframe.com. So thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you next time.